Hello, this is Professor Hamamoto. Welcome, one and all. It's April 30, year 2023, and it is 5 p.m. PDT. As promised, I've been working methodically, compiling all my reading material and doing some external research, and also summoning up some of the back knowledge I have going, I don't know, extending years, decades, about my knowledge of Hollywood history, American history, the popular culture of the 1960s and 1950s, in order to bring you today's talk, which is being presented on April 30th, which is Beltane, right? April 30th through May 1. And I'm not going to dwell on this because some people who are um, here strictly for sensationalism. They want to hear about Jane Mansfield being decapitated or something like that. They get upset if I take too long before getting into the gist of the topic, right? But I feel compelled to tell you that a resident of Davis, California, which has about 66,000 permanent residents and about 10,000 students roughly, it's a small town, California town. It's just outside of Sacramento, which is the capital city of California, and about 100 miles east of the Bay Area, Oakland, and right across the bay, of course, is San Francisco, which you'll be talking about extensively today, almost exclusively. And Davis, as well, is part of what I call the Satanic Triangle, which includes Stanford in the south, University of California, Berkeley in the north, and Davis in the eastern part. It's a triangle there. And a resident told me I was oblivious to this, but she said that there have been three killings. Two of them are outright murders. One of them is suspect. The one that's suspect, and this is what kind of led off the Beltane season, was the discovery of a suicide. It could have been someone who was suicided. Don't have much details on that. There are more details on the more recent two killings in Davis. They were both committed in a public park, right? These public venues. And we can talk about the psychology somewhere else. I want to get into the main topic today before we go into, but I just thought I should mention that you might want to kind of surveil your own community, right? Because most people by default tend to think that evil exists over there or somewhere else. Oh, it's in San Francisco. It's in California. What do you expect? It's California, right? But I've been reading about lately about Frank Lloyd Wright and many of the really beautifully designed homes that he had constructed for wealthy people. The site of these incredible tragedy, and they're in these out of the way places. They're not in Los Angeles. They're not in San Francisco. They're not in Sin City or New York. They're happening all over the place. And I would imagine in the Beltane season, you're going to see a lot of activity in the rural areas this time of year, right? And I think it's intensifying, and it's happening. It happened right here at Davis. And you can look at, if you're on my Patreon, I think that's the best way for you to be updated on the material that I've been gathering, because I don't want to consume too much time here. So I encourage you to go there. It's also the Patreon people who allow me to buy these expensive books on Jane Mansfield so that I can bring the extra value to you on Beltane. And part of the argument that I am putting forth here is that this one individual, Anton Sandor Lavey, right? That's not his birth name, but that's the name that the world knows him by through the Satanic Bible and two or three other books, including the Complete Witch and some other books that have kind of piqued my curiosity, especially the one on female witchcraft, which he supposedly on. There's some now that he's dead. There's some argument on who's responsible for the writing. His daughter's claiming, and I'll get into her in a moment, is claiming that a lot of that work was her own. Okay, so there was a good deal of dissension even with his own household toward the end. Right, despite all the power he claimed for himself and for his followers, he died. I think he had something like 5 hospitalizations in the last 6 months of his life. So a lifetime of putting hexes and curses on people eventually came back to him, right? That is also part of the law of the universe. Whatever religion you profess to practice, or non-religion, or anti-religion. Now, I'm not going to get into the definitions of what LaVey really represented. I'm not sure if he fully understood it himself. All that I can tell you definitively is that he made a big splash, as early as the late 1950s, but certainly when the so-called counterculture began to gain national attention through national media, primarily the Time Life people, which is CIA, and by now that a lot of that was engineered and orchestrated, which raises some questions about LaVey right off the bat for me in rereading all this information, because I lived through this period. I was when he was in his prime in the 50s, I was a little punk, 3, 4 year old, whatever. But by the mid 60s, late 60s, certainly I was a teenager, but I was old enough to understand what his message was and reject it fully back then and today, right? But today, however, I am rich by decades of study which understands Anton LaVey as not a departure from what I call the American Gothic, but a continuation of that dark tradition that was brought over to the Americas, and that includes what is now Canada and part of Latin America, northern Mexico, right in the United States, specifically for our purpose. By the way, my throat has nothing to do with some sort of irritation. It has to do with the fact that I've been almost exclusively studying and writing with very little verbal contact with the outside world. Right? I'm telling you this because Anton LaVey was he was a carny guy, right? And he was a speaker and a lecturer and all that. He kept his vocal cord, and he was a musician, but mainly keyboardist. So he kept his vocal cords intact. But if you don't have a lot of verbal interaction, like any other muscles, it'll go weak. So thank you for any people who are expressing concern. There's nothing organic going on here. It's just the lack of. I probably should do a little bit more singing. Just playing and singing. But like I said, yesterday alone, I spent 5 hours on this manuscript that I'm trying to push out the door. And then at the same time, I'm working on this Beltane special, if you will. So you might see me take a swig every once in a while from this cup of Earl Grey tea with just a hint of fresh lemon. All right. And I should do some warm up exercises, but I'm doing prep work for these talks almost to the moment of airtime. I'm just getting my material and my thoughts together, so I don't do the backstage type of warm up that I probably should. It's only an hour, so I don't think it's going to put any lasting stress on my voice. When I return to the lecture circuit, well, then I'll exercise those muscles. So let's get into it. I have a diversity of sources here, most of which are biographies. As you can imagine, Jane Mansfield has been written about extensively, and her rival, Jane, believe it or not, Marilyn Monroe was even contemplating suing Jane Mansfield for copying, stealing bits of her act, including the platinum blonde act. That was in her natural color, and her half open lips. That's something that Marilyn Monroe supposedly perfected. Here's another book. I talked about it earlier. In fact, if you want to really get a more historical grounding of what I'm talking about today, rather than repeating and going over ground that I already covered, I'd encourage you to look at the description. Don't do it now, do it later, and click on Macduff Lives Too. That's my friend and colleague, John O'Loughlin. We had an incredible talk this past Thursday, leading up to today's talk here, where I give the backstory. And while you're there, subscribe to his channel and support him on Rumble. He works very, very hard, and he doesn't get the views and subscriptions that he deserves. So I'm doing this as a way to kind of prime the pump on two levels. One, to help him out, but also to give you a more comprehensive background on a very, very deep topic here that I've been discussing over the past, actually, maybe 4 or 5 weeks, talking about 19th century, early 20th century occultism or spiritualism amongst wealthy women like Phoebe Hearst and Jane Stanford, both occultists and both patrons of major, what came to be, research institutions. Right? They were occultists, they were spiritualists, and they were in the Bay Area. Stanford's in the South Bay. Berkeley's what's called the East Bay. LaVey was in San Francisco, which is across the bay, but that's all Bay Area. Right. I don't know if he was aware of his predecessors, but they were much more deeply steeped in the occult and supernatural world than the followers of Anton LaVey. They thought in the 60s, the swinging 60s, they thought they were cutting edge. All the journalists and professionals, and there were a lot of law enforcement people that would come to his salons. And eventually he started admitting the public. Then the looky-loos got a little bit too much, and they eventually closed off that avenue. And I'll show you some photos here. The salon that he kept for a while before Satanism and Luciferianism and his brand of occultism became a little bit too cool. And by the time you have a lot of these rock figures of recent vintage, people like Marilyn, by the time they get into it, this stuff's old hat. It's new to them because this type of work really appeals strongly to alienated youth. And what youth, what adolescent, which human being that has reached the age of reason is not alienated? If you're not looking for answers, if you're not asking, why am I here? What is my purpose? Then probably watching too much TV and playing too many video games where they have that all answered for you there. Or listening too much Alice Cooper or something, who's in truth, he's a lot smarter than he appears. That's called shtick. In Yiddish, it's called shtick. But there's some people who are seriously into it, but that's not the gist of today's talk. And of course, Anton LaVey, toward the end, was asked incessantly what he thought about this person, this group, this development that supposedly was influenced by his Church of Satan, which he called, right? So the most recent book that I just finished reading it this morning, and I started reading it back to front. Just like they do in the world of the occult, everything's inverted, right? So I started reading from the back to front, and then after I got to the parts I wanted to read, then I read it from front to back. This book is excellent. I don't know why, but I was surprised that it was so good. And in all seriousness, I recommend that you get this book, not to find out about the theology, if you want to call it, of Satanism, according to LaVey. But to understand the larger historical milieu and culture whence he arose, right? Going back to his early, because all the stuff that you're reading on Wikipedia or you're seeing on these TubeView shows by these Insta pundits, they know LaVey's going to get a lot of click, right? You notice I didn't put it in the title here because I don't want that kind of person. Well, you can watch it, but I don't want the looky-loos, the tourists, to come to this channel just because it says LaVey on it, because that's the person who's going to gripe with the fact that I take too many digressions and don't tell him what he probably already learned from Wikipedia or some other person, some other personality on YouTube that supposedly is an expert on the occult. Right. So that's not what this book is about. This book is for serious, I guess you'd call them students of cultural history, of which he looms large. Anton LaVey looms large in American cultural history. I don't care what you say. You could be a born again Christian, an atheist, whatever religion. You could be a member of his church, whatever it is. This book warrants serious attention, and take from what you want. But I got a lot of great information, not just biographical, but cultural and historical information that was on the periphery of what went into the makeup of Anton LaVey, right? Sacred geometry, for example, his thoughts on music, because he was a master organist, master keyboard player, playing, I mean, the real thing, these pipe organs with thousands of pipes, right? Mighty Wurlitzer, Hammond, and of course, in home, the Hammond organ. And that was part of his appeal as a person, as a performer, and long before he became a professional Satanist. In fact, that's how he paid the bills. He was a professional musician. Everywhere he went, he would get hired, and he would play the calliope. I have never read about guitarists and sax players, Charlie Parker, trumpeters, Miles Davis, Lester Young, John Coltrane. I've read all the books about the great musicians, but I've never read anything, come across any material on someone who played the calliope professionally. You know what a calliope is? It's run by steam and it's always in danger of exploding because it's under pressure. It's like a pressure cooker. And they used to have them in the older, when circuses were for real, before they got sanitized, right? When magic was real in the sideshows, and they had, freaks, that's their own term, freaks. And by the way, there are a bunch of do-gooders in the 30s and 40s that said, well, we're not going to have any more freak shows. We're going to outlaw them. We're going to ban them. This is, but what that did was deprive midgets and pinheads and bearded ladies. You ever watched the film Freaks by Todd Browning? I think it's 1935. Check it out. It deprived them of a living. All right. These do-gooders, these people, and they're one of the pet peeves of Anton LaVey, and they're one of my pet peeves. Today they're called Karens, right? They're the people who are still wearing masks in line at the grocery store, right? The Karens. And they're the ones who teach women and gender studies at the university. By the way, we're going to dig on, we've been talking about the occult and the satanic origins of academic feminism, right? And they were very much in play with what's going on with Beltane 2013. In case I forget to mention, I've been alluding to it from time to time, from talk to talk, including talking about an ex dean of mine, and it was let's see. Oh yeah, she had the name of a well-known African American athlete. So I thought I'd get along, cool with her, but her name was Jessie Owens, except her middle name was Anne. But she was a straight up Wiccan, Satanist lesbian. And she was my dean. And man, every time I go met with her, I would be giving her these signs. And I was doing my reverse med. I was mirroring her, what she was doing. So the point is that I've had intimate, close encounters with these individuals at the university, and they're not just at UC Davis. They're at every major and even minor, like that's where all the wannabes are, right? Um, uh, Campus out there, and they're the ones that are behind a lot of the social chaos, the performances in the streets when Trump was president. A lot of them migrated from the theater department in English and comparative literature and went into something called performance studies, right? Which is really occultic uh, studies. We had one in my department. I could never understand why it was so easy for her to kind of move around. I think her dad was probably a Nisei snitch or spy or in the Nisei intelligence corps, the ones that help put other Niseis in concentration camps. Right? I'm not sure, but most of these people who hold these positions or have a strange knack for securing these jobs. It's kind of like the Brotherhood of the Bell. They didn't get there on their own. It's because they're connected in such a way, right? So this talk here comes from a wealth of professional and personal experience, having grown up through the era, also encountering the different iterations and variations on pop Satanism, which hit really big in the 1960s, and stop fixating on Sergeant Pepper and Aleister Crowley and the Tavistock. Those are the pop-up. That's for pop-up pundits. That's for numbskulls who want to be smart because they keep hearing it over and over, and they go, "Oh yeah, I know that." Right? Forget that. Forget the Dave McGowan psyop, right? Because there was part of the 60s, if it was not for these forces, the LaVey vision of the world, Macht, power and control, and I'll say race purification or eugenics, if it wasn't for these force countercurrents and forces during the 1960s, a lot of them who were in Laurel Canyon, if it wasn't for them, he would have gotten a lot more traction because he became very, as most of you know, LaVey became very influential in those circles, both in film, television, and music. Right. So it was a battle going on then. There's a battle going on now, as most of us are aware by now. You're seeing these people kind of silently, quietly being rolled up even now in 2023. We thought it was going to be something dramatic and wholesale when the great man on the white horse, Orange Man, came in and was elected. We thought this whole problem would be over, right? That seems to be one of the failings of American social psychology. We want everything, we want drive-through solutions, right? We want to be able to order freedom and sovereignty at the speaker with the clown, the Jack in the Box clown on the speaker. And by the time we get to the window, you get to pick up your Happy Meal. But life doesn't work that way. It's a struggle. And this is something LaVey was quite honest about, right? He was contemptuous of the people who got into pop Satanism. He was disparaging. He disliked them most of all, the ones who are the trend hoppers, right? The ones who might accidentally have tuned to the station, or the growing number of younger people who are my older ex-students who are watching me still because they heard me the first go around at UC Davis while I was being persecuted by a bunch of witches and gay warlocks. You know, there's one guy down there in American, so he was totally into Star Trek and Boy Scouts. He wrote nothing, and we know what the Boy Scouts were about. And he knew what he saw that I saw what was going down. Okay. So anyway, let me get into some of the material here by first sharing with you some photos from this book, and then we're going to get into. I talked about this with John. That's why I'm saying go back to that show of this recent Thursday because I go into it more deeply. We're going to get into California Infernal in number 2, but we'll go with The Secret Life of a Satanist right now. Here we go. Okay, that's the cover art. That's LaVey in his most intimidating, menacing pose. This is him before he shaved his head. He shaved his head, incidentally, on Beltane. And one of the reasons that he decided to go with the goatee and the menacing look is because he found that he was very attractive to women, right? It must be the bad boy vibration or something, or the sort of leering type of overt sexuality that he exuded. He was a carnival barker. He also worked in these mind reading shows, so he understood human psychology at the very and on Sunday they would rent out the tents to Christian ministers, so he got to see the duality of humanity in this golden age before TV, before the internet. Well, there was cinema, but you could only go once a week, right? It was not like wall to wall Netflix, right? So he got to see that. He understood people very well. Okay, if I come off sound like a fan, I'm not. I'm being objective to what strengths he brought and what truths that he came across and shared with the rest of us squares. Right? So you do not have to be a member of the Church of Satan. A Satanist, a Luciferian, an atheist, or some a Wiccan or whatever, a pagan, neo-pagan, to benefit from his well-earned experience as a musician and carnival person, circus, a wild animal handler. I'm talking about the big cats, which we'll get into in a moment. So this is before he shaved his head, and I think by that time he'd already set up shop in the famous it's called the Black House. It's a Victorian house that was about to be torn down, and he bought, even though it said sold on it, he walked in the house with a realtor and he charmed the person who owned it, who happened to be an old time madame. Right? It was a whorehouse. It was also a big place where people would go to get booze during Prohibition. There's sporting men there. All the big wig politicos would go there for women and drink and gambling and whatever else. That was the house. And so he managed to buy it. And I think it was torn down. I don't think it's there anymore. But it's called the Black House. We'll see a picture of it in a moment. Promise. And you can see in the background these symbols that I don't need to decode for you. Let me see. Let's move on. Okay, this is something that I didn't know, but LaVey was very much into creating these artificial companions. He had a term of his own of it, but it's today what we call love dolls, right? Only now in 2000, over recent years, have they, these forward-looking technologists, or if you want to call them that, have started perfecting this, right? Disney was working on this. Hewlett-Packard was working on this early on. It's called audio animatronics back in the 50s. And this might be our future, right? Our post-sex future, where there'll be no man, no woman, no gender, no overt sexuality. And LaVey was all about overt sexuality. He was not shy about it because he knew where the civilization was heading. He knew where the culture was going. And it was towards dehumanization. And the chief point of attack would be human sexuality, both female and male. So he was anti-academic feminist. Right. Anyway, so this was one of his creations. He was an artist, a sculptor. He did assemblage, in addition to being, he's just an overall creative type. And this is one of his creations, and he worked on different collaborations with people. And the idea is that these manufactured artificial companions would help resolve the problems of sexuality in society. I think it was a utopian dream. I don't necessarily agree with it. I'm just sharing with you something, an interesting fact of his creative life that I never knew about. It's an interesting thought. I'm sure other people have come up with that argument, but he was doing it, right? There's any number of you. Oh yeah, I thought of that. But have you done it? Have you done even, one little tiny tincture of what of all the brilliant ideas that you had? And I asked the same question of myself. The answer is no. He did, to his credit. I don't agree with it, the bedrock, but I have to respect. If nothing else, he was a great. He was playing all these majestic organs when they had real movie theaters. You understand? Not these mall monstrosities that I refuse to go into. All right. Continuing. This is the first in modern times, first satanic wedding in modern times. It was around 65, 66. The woman on the left, of course, she's an heiress, well-connected, prominent family back east. The guy on her husband in the middle is, I think he was a journalist, a radical journalist, communist. The Bay Area is full of leftists, and the there's a close connection between Satanism and communism, as you well know, right? Karl Mordecai, who the world later knew as Karl Marx, comes out of that tradition through his family of probably Sabbatean rabbis. I'm just guessing. Nobody in Marx's scholarship, or Marxian scholars, they're all leftists. They don't like to talk about religion. They don't like to talk about the occult because it's not materialist science like their hero, Karl Marx, insisted on. So there is a big gap in Marxist or Marxist studies, and that's his whole family line. That's something for some of the emerging scholars can do. Just trace his bloodline and see what you find. I think it probably goes back to Zabbatai Zev. I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, this is the ritual, and I should give credit this early junction to a German photographer named Walter Fischer, German, not German American, straight up German, who sold these photos into syndication, mostly for the German and larger European market. I don't think he got a lot of sales in America. And I find all this information is very well. This book is chock full of detail, which I appreciate. But because that allows me to speculate, yeah, maybe Walter Fischer was an intelligence operative, right? Maybe his cover was doing celebrity photography in LA and Hollywood, but he was also doing blackmail operations. There's all kinds of questions that arise in these types of scenarios, and the good books will raise more questions while at the same time answering and introducing information that you never knew about. Anyway, let's move on because I want to keep this short or within reason, within bounds. Okay, the person on the right this is the obligatory Jane Mansfield photo. It's also by Walter Fischer, but it showed up in this book. Has great photos too, by the way. Really good section here, published by Feral House. Adam Parfrey, who's deceased. I'm inferring that he was a Satanist or was sympathetic to Satanism, and his the major titles of his publishing house, which I found a lot of good material on Feral House, reflected that interest that no other publishers were really paying, or they were studiously ignoring them. So I have to give Feral House credit for bringing this literature, including LaVey, he wasn't the only author, to the fore. But I also have to keep in mind that he himself was most likely invested in this form of anti-Christian belief or anti-religion, anti-God belief, if I can characterize it that way. I'm not going to try, right? But just to summarize, and here's another, I think it's this is another Walter Fischer photo. It's staged, and this is Jane Mansfield on the right, and so the topic of discussion, LaVey in the background, And those little horns are made out of bone, by the way. I imagine they're probably polished goat horns that were sawed off and secured there somehow. He had a whole collection of costumes, artifacts, artwork, you name it, that went into the Black House that he bought. I told you the backstory there, which later was fought over by his survivors after he died. Very painful death, by the way. I'm not gloating about it. I'm just telling you that he did not die peacefully in his sleep. But all this stuff was fought in the most base form in the courts by his daughters and his wives and his companions. And as he was dying, he said, "Oh, gee, well, doesn't matter. The Church of Satan's going to live on. I've created havoc amongst my family, but the Church of Satan will live on." So that's Jane. Okay, well, let me tell you, this book here is, I didn't show it to you yet. Here, it's called Jane Mansfield, The Girl Couldn't Help It. It's a University Press of Kentucky, but it's more of an homage to Jane Mansfield than a critical review of her career, her life, her profession. And it's very defensive when it gets to whether Jane Mansfield was indeed a member of the Church of Satan, number one, and second, a practicing Satanist. And from other sources, and this is why you have to read more widely. And I'm saying I've done an exhaustive reading. I've just got obtained, thanks to the Patreon people, the most promising books that are currently in print. I'm sure that there's material that came out in the 50s and 60s that are worth looking at, but I don't aspire to be a Jane Mansfield nor an Anton LaVey expert. I'm just trying to sift through some of the more salient aspects of the career here. But if you only read this book, you'll have a distorted picture, because according to other sources that I've read, including this one, and of course, she was one of the mainstays of the Church of Satan. This was his last. You'll see her picture in a moment. Blanche Barton, excellent writer, excellent. I hope she writes more books. But in this book, the claim is made is that Jane Mansfield was a member of the Church of Satan and was a practicing Satanist. We all knew she studied the books, and we all know that she had an IQ of 163. So she had a native intelligence. Marilyn Monroe, who, by the way, we'll get to in a moment, also had a short-lived. In the case of Jane Mansfield, they had a longer relationship with Marilyn. I think he was seeing her for only a few weeks, but he maintained like a 10-year correspondence. But he never saw her after. It was just before she blew up big time. But Jane Mansfield also had intellectual aspirations. She wanted to be around. I mean, she married an egghead. She married Arthur Miller, for goodness sake. Right? Arthur Miller would say, "Okay, Marilyn, don't bother me. I'm going to be in my bedroom and my office. I'm working on The Crucible or View from the Bridge, or I'm writing the screenplay to The Misfits. Don't bother me, Marilyn." Like, wow. Talk about self-denial. That's Arthur Miller, but he was brilliant. By the way, Arthur Miller wrote one of the classics of American cinema, The Misfits, and Marilyn, that's my personal favorite. She was in the movie with Clark Gable and Montgomery Clift and Eli. I can go on and on. Check that out. The Misfits. That was Arthur Miller. But I mention this because Anton LaVey had a knack for coming into contact with people in the most unlikely circumstance. I'll get to the Maryland story back in a moment. But anyway, I'm just repeating what I read in these books and other sources about Jane Mansfield. She was a practicing member of the Church of Satan, and we know what happened, how she wound up. Right? No, and it didn't happen on Beltane. But certain other events happened on Beltane, when we're talking about LaVey, and I'll get to that in a moment. Feel like I'm talking too much. Okay, wait a minute. When I missed something. Yeah, I wanted to give the author her recognition. That's Blanche Barton. He LaVey liked platinum blondes. He liked a certain body type. He was not shy about letting you know body type in women and a certain type of sexuality that they exuded, and they in turn were highly attracted to him. Even before he became the Anton LaVey that we knew, he was always being pursued by women in the carnival and the circus, and that told him a lot about sexuality in general and how important it is to everybody, man or woman, regardless of time or space. So anyway, that's the author. Her name's Blanche Barton. I don't know when it says there, buy the book, read it. I'd say it was probably in the, early 70s, maybe. I don't know. Okay. And this, I'm not just putting this up for your prurient interest, but this is one of the daughters of Anton LaVey and his, I can't say wife because they were not ever formally married. They were, let's call them domestic partners or partners, right? As they say in, we're partners for 24 years. So you can see what a sticky mess it was when he died and had all these artifacts and these priceless treasures and manuscripts and book royalties and real estate and vintage cars, and they had to divide it all up. And how all these people, including her, his daughter, Zena is her name, Zena LaVey, who was one of his most trusted and prominent spokespersons at the height of the Church of Satan. But later on, at a certain point, she left the Church of Satan. She renounced the Church of Satan, and she disinherited her own father, Anton LaVey. Furthermore, she accused him of abuse, and that's in this book. This is by LaVey's last long-term companion, Blanche Barton. She's very honest about his relationships there. Right? She could have covered it up out of self-protection, but as a writer, I think her objectivity is laudable, considered what the enormity of the project. But she herself is the source of this information that I'm passing on to you. Now, we'll get to this in a moment. But when I first heard about Zena LaVey was from this book, from some photos, and it was Zena LaVey undergoing supposedly the first baptism, satanic baptism at the so-called the Black House. She was 3 years old at the time. There's some pictures of her as a toddler. We'll get to them in a moment. And so there was a ritual, there was a ceremony, and Walter Fischer was there taking photos of it, and there were people around, members. There was a sort of an inner core, the Church of Satan, that would be invited to the more special events, in addition to the walkthroughs, the tourists, the drive-bys, those type of people. So that's her, but understand that she later denounced the whole relationship. I don't know if it involves sexual abuse, but she said abuse. But that's kind of nebulous. I don't know what it is. This is something that maybe she'll write about in her own book if she doesn't have one already. So keep an eye on that. That's and she's beautiful, like her mother, Diane. I don't know if I have pictures of her. It's the same body type, and he liked the platinum blonde types. He liked Zaftig, that's Yiddish, full-bodied women. And that's one area where he's out of step in the 60s and the 70s, where you had Leslie Hornby, who was foisted upon the American fashion scene. She's better known as Twiggy, as in a tree twig. She was really skinny. And that was your beginning of your androgyny trend that you're seeing today, where some say that there's a good number of top international supermodels who are in truth transsexuals. They're men, male to female. This is something that LaVey didn't address specifically, but he saw where the society was taking us into this androgyny and leaving out the male, destroying, some would say blending if you're a Wiccan, right? The male principle and the female principle. He wanted to preserve it according to pagan, right? Or even Christian or Orthodox Judaism principles. By the way, just in passing, I something dawned on me while I was doing some writing yesterday on Willie Brown and these people in California came out of Hastings School of Law, and because we're talking about Beltane, right, and goddess worship. The middle name of Kamala Harris, your future president, possibly, or vice president, again, with Michael Obama. Her middle name is what? Devi. She's the mother goddess in Hinduism. You think that's an accident? No, not at all. Devi. So I'm suggesting, as a form of word magic, that whenever we talk about Kamala Harris, we always use her three names, Kamala Devi Harris. I'm going to be doing that. Just like we talk about Henry Lee Lucas or Lee Harvey Oswald, right? We always give these serial killers their full name, or these supposed, even though Oswald didn't hurt anybody, right? We know that. They always give these people who have been booked and stuffed and cuffed again. So let's give Kamala Harris her due. Kamala Devi Harris, right? The goddess of destruction and fertility at once. All right. And if you don't think that was part of the calculus of contemporary politics, then you're not really thinking very hard. You're a iPhone zombie is what you are, right? Even though you're watching this channel, you're on the iPhone a lot. You know, you can't stay away from it because you don't know what to do with your fingers, and even worse, you don't know what to do with your mind when you're alone, when you're by yourself, or you're in public, or you're driving, or you're in the waiting room for your insurance agent or wherever. You don't know what to do with yourself. You're not comfortable, so you go to the black rock, the black screen, right? And I mentioned that because Anton LaVey was going to start a movement against television. He says, you think Satanism is bad? You think religion is bad? He says, television takes the cake. It measures its audience, its demographic, its product, its service in terms of millions. That's television. And what is the iPhone? The satanic iPhone, but a portable computer / television to your soul. That is the black mirror. So if, don't think you're above all this. Do not think you're exempt from the critique here. I certainly don't, even though I don't have an iPhone. Don't use it. I have it somewhere. I don't know where it is. I don't use it. There's no use for it here in my world. So again, I'm in agreement with Anton LaVey. I'm a television product. That tube was aimed at my consciousness, right? I was going to be one of the drones that he despises, right? Those consumers that were being led down this merry avenue through these commercials. And that's not just because he's old school and was raised in the pre-television era. He knew what was going on. He's a brilliant, intelligent individual, and he had a lot to say, a critique of the society, culture, and politics, much of which I agree. It's the Satanism that's a deal breaker for me. That's not enough for discussion, and that's not even part of the deal, right? But I need to study him. So do you. But we need to study him in a way that goes far beyond that of the YouTubers. I think this is the last one from that book. Okay, yeah, it is. Let me remove this. Okay, let us move into this book and realize that these are screenshots. And if you want a really nicely bound, which is rarity these days, hardback copy with good paper, coated paper, black and white. There's some color photos as well. And it even has one of these sewn in bookmarkers in it, pink ribbon. And this was her color, by the way. It's not an accident they picked pink. Jane Mansfield was the pink lady. They didn't call her that. That's just what I blurted out. But that was her color. And she and Mickey Hargitay, which was one of her husbands, he was a bodybuilder. Mickey Hargitay. And this is before there was gyms all over the place. I mean, physical culture, that was like drinking juice. It's like being a vegetarian. No one was doing that in the 50s. But Mickey Hargitay was way ahead of his time. He was in physical culture. And I think he was Mr. Universe. But she liked guys like that who were, muscular and commanding and kind of brutal to her. That was part of her sexual, according to Anton LaVey. She had a very strong sexually masochistic streak in her. Privately, she was an insecure, timid. This is not unusual, right? But this is what was revealed in this book. So let's take a look at the work of Walter Fischer, the German celebrity photographer from the 50s and 60s, who I suspect was a West German intelligence operative, or maybe he was East German, or maybe he was both, or maybe he was also working for the Soviets. Maybe he was also working for the CIA and the MI6. I don't know. These are all questions that we can ask based on what we know about other persons in this universe. And I'll tell you right now, in case you tune out prematurely, my suspicion is that Anton LaVey himself was an intelligence asset. All right. He was protected. I mean, there would be San Francisco Police Department cops that would come to his gatherings, his soiree, his salon, right? And he had politicos that would come and visit him. He was well connected. This is San Francisco we're talking about. It's the smallest big city in the United States. So let's check out. Here's the cover. When I first saw that, I thought that was a dead chihuahua, but it's in truth a live chihuahua. She had 4 of them at her peak. She had I'm talking about Jane Mansfield, had 4 chihuahuas, 2 of which died in that fatal accident. This is her family. She was a fertility goddess, unlike, well, Marilyn Monroe was a sex goddess, but she was unable to conceive children. This is one of the ironies. And I read this in the biography, one of the first real critical biographies that tied Marilyn Monroe into the Kennedy brothers and U.S. intelligence, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and the mafia. It's a great book. It's by Anthony Summers. He's an Irish writer. He has his own axe to grind, but I recommend. It's called Goddess. I read it along with a friend of mine. We were traveling through Germany right after the wall fell back in 89, 90. Remember the Berlin Wall fell? So we went over there to Berlin, and one of the books he brought along was Goddess. And so we both after he finished, I read it. And so we just talked about Marilyn Monroe and sifting through it. ever so closely. And that's where I learned that she had problems with. She had so many abortions. She had so many infections, gynecological, that it was almost impossible. It proved to be impossible, and that's all she wanted. According to her, she wanted to have children. She wanted to have family. This is something that Jane Mansfield did have in abundance. I think she wound up with 5 children total. 3 of those little children were in the back seat. I think it was a Buick automobile. When the driver hit this tractor trailer outside of Biloxi, Mississippi, when she was leaving a nightclub performance. It was paying big money for her back then, $10,000 overseas, maybe 20,000 US. That's a lot of money back then. But you can read about the accident. But 3 of those children fortunately survived. They were in the back seat and they were tiny. The 3 adult passengers in the front, they were almost decapitated. I think I've told your story before, so I'm not going to belabor it. But she had one of the children, by the way, later became an actress, Mariska Hargitay. She is the daughter of Mickey Hargitay, who was Mr. Physical Culture, and Jane Mansfield. And she was on Law and Order for many years. She's Christian. She's not a Satanist. And she was 3 years old when her mother was killed in that accident. So she was a good mother. She was a good parent. She was a family person. I found this photograph to be fascinating because this is Walter Fischer. I'm doing the German, or trying to do the German pronunciations best I. Walter Fischer on the left, dapper guy, right? Consummate professional. He looks like a spook, if you ask me, a spook with a camera. And on the right, of course, is Alfred Hitchcock. And when I was a kid, like a lot of people my age, we only knew Alfred Hitchcock from Alfred Hitchcock Presents on TV. We didn't know he was this famous movie director. At least I didn't till later. We would see his movies being run on TV, but he wasn't the big fetish item of the so-called film scholars at USC or UCLA or NYU, or these places which today are the bastions of GLBTQ plus transsexual ideology. That's why I mention it now. It's the film schools, performance studies, I'm telling you, and of course sociology. We expect anthropology and some of the social science, English departments, so-called humanities. We can expect that, but the film studies is very, very much infiltrated by the true satanic, which is the inversion, or more properly say Luciferian inversion of knowledge and human experience. It's in film studies, right? And that's why we see a lot of creepy movies being made by a lot of creepy people coming out of USC and UCLA and NYU. Those are the big 3. And you're talking to someone who taught 1 year at the UCLA Film School. They got rid of me real quick because I predicted the LA riots. Right? It's not just Anton LaVey that has second sight, right? And it's not second sight. It's just reading the culture, reading society, reading people on a much more deep level than others, and articulating and putting it in a framework, just like I'm doing it right now at this talk. And that's what good writers and directors do, including Alfred Hitchcock on the right. And in the middle, of course, is Tippi Hedren. You might not know who she is, but she's the mother of Melanie Griffith, who we haven't seen for a while, but she was an excellent. Alfred Hitchcock supposedly had some sort of fixation, just like LaVey. He liked blondes, like Grace Kelly, right? That was one of his favorite actresses that he'd like to work with. And of course, Tippi Hedren was in The Birds, which, by the way, was filmed not too far from here, right? Incredible movie. And it was, it was originally a story by Daphne du Maurier, which I read. Okay, I do my homework. I'm going back and I'm rereading Poe. I'm going back and reading H.P. Lovecraft, and it all fits into this larger dark history of American civilization that we didn't get in K through 12 or even at the university. And by the way, on May 2nd, I'm going to be on Caravan to Midnight with John B. Wells. They have thousands of listeners live and a huge audience. And the topic of, and I'm going to be there from 7, I'm talking about PDT, Pacific Daylight, 7 p.m. to 9 o'clock, or probably 7:30. So I'm going to be there for a long stretch of time. And the topic is going to be Occult American, Occult University, like I've been sharing with you. So I'm going to be summarizing to the larger American audience on this radio show. Okay. So the word's is getting out there little by little. And you will help facilitate this process if you subscribe, if you share, and if you support me through Patreon, because there's no one else out there that's doing this work. Right? Don't confuse me with Bert, that ass clown, Brett Weinstein at Portland State, or Jordan Peters. They're both losers. They're both come from the university, but they're both losers who are plucked out of obscurity to take away from me, who was the original gangster professor dissenter. In fact, it was on an early, few years ago now, guest appearance on Caravan to Midnight with the great broadcaster, a true radio man, John B. Wells. It was on that show where I introduced the American public to the concept of woke. And now that's how we hear, woke this, woke that. I don't use the term anymore. But I said woke, and he said, what? I said, yeah, woke. He says, you know. And then I went, I knew he wouldn't have known this, but that's how these ideas get out. Okay. So I'll have some surprises for you on May 2nd, the day after Beltane. All right. And by the way, Zena LaVey, she left the church formally, guess what, on Beltane. She was baptized on Beltane. And when she left the church, she resigned. She left on Beltane. Right. These are the little tidbits that are quite relevant to today's special on Beltane. So that's Tiffy Hedren. I'm going to look into her background a little bit more if I get the time. Hitchcock, I've read quite a bit about, and I think there's a lot of cliches around him, but I want to see if he's connected. Just very quickly, because the photos are kind of blurry. On the left, that's Nat Cole. He had a great trio, jazz trio. He's piano and singing before he became a pop star. But anyway, that's Walter Fischer on the left. And of course, later his daughter, Natalie Cole, became a huge pop star. And on the right, you have Walter Fischer with, I don't know, what's his name? Davidovitz? We know him as Kirk Douglas, right? The man with the golden cleft chin, Kirk Douglas on the right. And then later there's Michael Douglas, right? He wrote a great autobiography, The Ragpicker's Son. He comes from, humble origins. His parents were, immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe. I don't know if they were from Ukraine or Russia or whatever, but, and I mention this because a lot of those ideas migrated here, just like a lot of the Beltane and the Northern European occultism came through. A lot of it came from Eastern Europe, courtesy of that diaspora of Eastern and Central European Jews, of Kirk Douglas's generation. And that may be a surprise to you. Kirk Douglas is not they gave him an Anglo-Saxon name. They had to Britishize him or Americanize him by taking away his birth name. By the way, I came across this book. It's called In Search of the Phoenicians, and it's by another academic press, Princeton Academic Press, and it talks about how the Phoenicians, the different ethnicities, and let me just read here. And the reason I'm bringing this in is because it's going to be academic literature itself that exposes the occultic and the pagan infrastructure. This is going to be one of the points I'm giving you a preview. So one of the points I'm going to make with John B. on Tuesday. But it goes back way, thousands of years. But we're going to use academic research itself against the GLBTQ people who are there as a distraction from the true history of world civilization and the forces that conspired to create these synthetic problems that we're being faced with today, from the genetic to the kinetic, right? It goes deep, and you have to understand this history and not be distracted also, which I'll get into, distracted by the Church of Satan or Anton LaVey, because he was intelligence flypaper, because in his region there was all kinds of interesting behavioral and physical science experimentation that was being put in play, including the internet, including Silicon Valley. That infrastructure was going in while he was gathering all the news and all the attention on the TV networks and Time Life CIA magazine, right? Silicon Valley, right? The serpent was growing while we were watching Anton LaVey giving his performances, and that was his main function, I believe. Flypaper, it's called. Anyway, there's a whole section here on the Tophet cult. Let me read very quickly. Diodorus is just one of the more than 30 Greek and Roman writers who say that the Phoenicians and especially the Carthaginians sacrificed their children. Okay. One of his cardinal principles is do not harm children, this is LaVey. Do not harm children, do not harm animals. So we're in agreement there, but he doesn't represent the totality of Luciferians and Satanists out there. He does not. In fact, if you've seen one of my previous talks, we know that the so-called Federal Reserve was consecrated on a blood altar that was used by the indigenous people on Jekyll Island when those millionaires descended upon there and built their giant mansions to capture the American and the world banking system, which is now coming to an end. It was a sacrificial human sacrifice blood altar there, right? Check out one of my earlier talks, which are difficult to find on TubeU because my playlist is purposely being suppressed. So I'm breaking it down. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just truncate this talk here and just remind you that or make the point that LaVey was a crypto-fascist. He drew a lot of his ideas from Third Reich showmanship. Of course, he knows better than to express any admiration or even fondness for Adolf Aloysius Hitler, but he obviously drew from him. And there's one thing that he and Hitler and the National Socialists shared, and that's a fascination and an understanding and a deep knowledge of the pre-Christian pagan occult tradition. And this is one of the books that I cited. It's called The Occult in National Socialism. Good book. I found it later that the author of this incredible book is himself an occultist. You got to watch out. That's why you got to read all the books. He also has a cult built around himself, but this happens to be an excellent piece of research here. But anyway, as we wind up here, our talk on Beltane, this is the book, The Occult of May 1, National Day of Celebration of the German People. Here's an example of the clear usurpation of the Internationalist Marxist Workers' Day celebration, May Day. Okay, this is what the National Socialists, is what the Communists have in common. And this is what the Satanists have in common. And this is what your academic feminists have in common, and your people in performance studies. And even though they might not be aware of that legacy, that stream runs strong. It's an underground river that's a current through U.S. academia. And that's why if you just watch a pop-up pundit saying, oh, that's cultural Marxism, or that's a libtard, all this name calling, you're not going to get anywhere because you are not even scratching the surface. In fact, you are falling for the bait that's being put out there by people like Tucker Carlson, Stu the Auctioneer Peters, Ben Shapiro, Alex Jones, all those people. They have all the phrases and they throw it out there, and they're like Anton LaVey. They're like chumming, like fishermen. They put it out there that the fish come in there and they get netted, but nothing changes. Okay, let me finish up. Let me put myself back on the screen and yeah, I'm running out of time, so I got to make it quick. This is another, that's from the book here. This is another tell that LaVey might have been in the intelligence world, but his longtime partner, Blanche Barton, has a long section about how he was quite well acquainted with Israeli gun runners out of San Francisco, Irgun, and all these outlawed, even in the U.S. Organizations, and they were taking war trophies after World War II. Right, a lot of GIs brought gun trophies back from Japan and Germany and Europe and Italy, and they were confiscated, and they were supposed to be spiked or melted down or thrown into the bay, but they were intercepted, and a lot of those guns wound up as part of the arsenal of the struggle against British colonialism in Palestine by Israelis, right? Zionists, political Zionists. So Aquino was acquainted with these people, very well acquainted. So there might be an intelligence connection there that needs to be looked at. And also, I didn't dwell on this because most of you know that Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino is an offshoot of the Church of Satan, right? There's not a single mention of Aquino here. I need to know a little bit more about the cause, the reason, and the fallout of this division between the. Maybe they never really had a falling out. Maybe it's like a Coke and Pepsi type of situation. I don't know, but there's all these different questions that need to be addressed, and maybe you'll have some insights. You can put them down on the comment here. And as I mentioned, he's a crypto fascist. He might be a crypto Nazi. I'm talking about LaVey, crypto Nazi. And because one of the tells is that it's quite evident that even though he might have not used the term, he was a eugenicist, Anton LaVey. I would not be welcome. I'm a yellow person. I'm one of the vermin that he grew up despising in the 1930s and the 40s with all the comic books, amazing stories, and movie serials about Ming the Merciless. I am Ming the Merciless. So I would not be welcome into that salon anyway, even if I wanted to, and I didn't. He talked about breeding. He talked about let the underclass go. They're not smart enough to make it. Let them go. Right? This is years after Margaret Sanger. I don't even know if he understood that California was one of the bastions of a racial improvement in breeding. Right? I told you they're taking the name off. They took the name off of Robert Millikan down at Caltech because he was a racist, eugenicist, white supremacist. This is the Rose Bowl land, which is a celebration, an occult celebration of the Rosicrucian racial purity deal. That was a great talk. I gave it there. That's Caltech. And I told you they took down the name of some of those them anthropologists down in Stanford, but it's not going to erase the history because I know the history. I'm sharing with you. That same thing happened to Kroeber, A.L. Kroeber at Berkeley. They took his name off. He's the father, one of the fathers of American anthropology, which is about racial science. But LaVey he never read these people, but he's part of that milieu. Do you understand that? So this is something you're not going to get from the tube viewers and the pop-up pundits. They're just going to give you the sensational, rehashed, regurgitated information that allows the dumbbells to say, oh, I know that. I must be smart. Or the ones who are tourists and buy I think the Satanic Bible has sold about 250,000 copies, something like that. It's still making money. It's never been out of print. One of the day trippers to Satanism, and be careful. It's not up to me to issue the warning. But and finally, I would say one of the major takeaways that this might be revealed in time. I don't have the resources at the time or even the inclination to check it out, but someone who's watching this might want to sniff this out. And that's the hypothesis that he was some sort of intelligence asset. And I know this from reading Tim O'Neill's book, Chaos, which talked about how the Manson family, much of these characters in the 60s, and other books about serial killers, for example, were the product of intelligence operations. I think that the Golden State Killer might have been one of those. They finally apprehended. I gave a talk on that. And I've told you recently about the killings in Little Davis, California. Right? Is it an intelligent operation? I don't know. It could be just your psycho killer, like we're led to believe. But we're beginning to become more sophisticated and understand what behind a lot of these fear tactics, right, that undergird the horror movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right, or the House on Haunted Hill, or the Hammer films that I gave a talk on. You say, well, that's not really scaring people enough. We're going to have to really go out in the community and do it, especially a university town like Davis that's full of a lot of supposedly bright, intelligent professionals who in truth scare very quickly and very easily and are very easy to convert into the fear factor, right? Which was one of Joe Rogan's shows, Fear Factor. How does a comedian gain so much serious attention as a purveyor of serious thought? Give that some consideration. Anton LaVey was right. And it's not TV. It's the Joe Rogan show. Whatever. Okay. I've exceeded my time by 15 minutes, 16 minutes. I'm going to leave it off right now. Thank you for your indulgence. And I only touch the tip of the iceberg. I didn't even get to talk about hypnotism experiments at Stanford. LaVey was supposed to be the king of hypnotism. No, the king of hypnotism was at Stanford University. His name, he was a professor. His name was Ernest Hilgard, PhD, and his wife, who was a medical doctor. And Stanford and Harvard had their separate hypnotic suggestibility scales. Right, this is back in 1965. That's why I say Anton LaVey was flypaper distraction from the real McCoy that was taking place at the occult university. Remember that. Understand it. God willing, I'll see you all on Tuesday. The show is broadcast Caravan to Midnight on YouTube. Please watch it, put comments, and I'll try to put on my best performance for you, even though you're on YouTube, but for my Patreons, for the people who are serious about these issues. Okay. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you spending this part of Sunday with me. Beltane. Keep alert, right? Transition between the 30th and May 1st. I might take a walk down the river here at midnight, see if there's any unusual activity. I'll take a little flashlight. I'll take my bowl, my staff. It looks like a walking stick with me, and I'll check it out. I'll see if there's any hounds howling or barking or any rustling in the reeds in the river. Right. They like bodies of water. And but I'll take care to make sure I'm not one of those bodies that are found in the water. Okay. But something evil comes this way. Beltane 2013. Peace out, y'all. Thank you. Bye.